Now, when we talk about a reference document, I find that my sessions are stronger and I get faster at building them. But I can completely see the other side where someone is fearful of having to even ask those questions of the players. But then I go back to the idea of starting with a village and opening the door to being organic in your world building together, like in your cooperative world building. You can use your session 0 as that first session in the village. And this is, I think, where that term 0.5 comes from that I started coining, that it isn't, you are playing the game, you are experiencing the game in real time, but you're also making retcons, you're making adjustments to how you interact with the world. You're asking those questions that sometimes when a player is building their character for the very first time, they may not know how to even approach those questions. And I'm not saying it takes a lot to do that, to approach those questions, but sometimes people are so resistant to the idea of that, they just want to start playing, or they already are trying to compress the knowledge of just building the character. They just want to go and see what happens. And then through the experience of play, we'll start to be able to answer those questions. So I wonder if a nuanced way of blending this is to take a few of those very helpful questions and present them during that session as we're playing the game and understanding the mechanics and just messing around. And what we do is we say this, hey everybody, this session isn't necessarily canon. We're going to play around with this and use it as like our way to both understand how the game works, to maybe I'll put you into a combat. You can experience how combat might flow. And that also shows you how the numbers work in play. And if you decide, you know what, I don't want to be a fighter, I'd like to be a monk, then we can rebuild that and we change that in that session, because we get like a practice session. And in that practice session, maybe we also get some of our questions answered, because the players might be so tunnel visioned in just, I made a character, I'm a dwarf and I go swing my club and I like swinging my hammer, that they're so focused on that we may not have even approached the thought of who are my parents. And maybe that's something we get to experience while we're playing the game. And that, I have been at tables, have been so energizing sometimes when we get to play and then go, by the way, your parents show up. What are their names? And the player has to go, George and Sally. And it's hilarious and fun, and now it's canon. My parents' names are George and Sally. Do you have a good relationship with them, or is it kind of rough? Well, they always wanted me to become a chicken farmer, and I want to be an adventurer. So this is how I think I interact with them. And then it's not also me, the DM, dictating this is the relationship you have with your parents. It can maybe be an organic thing. Now, that works at some tables and maybe it doesn't work at others, and I can see both ends of that. But I think for the players that I've worked with that really want to hit the ground running, I can see the resistance to having to answer some of those questions before they roll the dice. But when I'm teaching learning games, especially, like really like complete base zero, level zero knowledge, sometimes for the younger ones, we hit the ground running so that they can experience the game mechanics. And then we'll ask those questions and build that world together. And then kind of like at the end review, okay, this is what we figured out. This is what we like to establish. What could we change about the world? What do you think worked well? What do you think was sort of confusing? Do you have other questions about combat? And that way we can sort of all reflect on that experience together and then say, okay, do you want that to be our first session? Or are there any other things you'd like to change? And then together we can tell that story.
Let me rewind to the very beginning of this podcast episode. So, inferential world building, which is the topic that we've been diving into this whole episode, really is a technique, mindset, whatever you want to call it, to developing immersion as a priority in your game experience. to look back on all the tools that we've mentioned and all the advice that we've given. Immersion is a advanced skill set that is not appropriate for every table and is very permission based for your players. If your players are not comfortable being vulnerable in a highly immersive setting, it is probably not going to end the way you want it to. So all the tools we've mentioned as part of inferential world building, reference docs, the 10 character questions I just said, even a session 0 or a session 0.5, all of those are tool sets that allow a DM and a table to immerse themselves in an imaginary space, again, which inherently also leads to emotional vulnerability. There are a lot of players that will violently react against that. So if I have new players, immersion is not a priority. Understanding the mechanics of the game is. Not even storytelling, because I don't want them to wrap themselves up with, again, getting stuck with their expectations of what an authentic D&D experience is. Because, again, what's authentic is going to be different for each table. So if it's new players, especially younger new players, setting boundaries and rules is thing number one. Get them to be nice to each other, teach them what an attack roll is and how that's different than a damage roll. I would even say teenagers is like the minimum age group. I wouldn't do this with anyone younger than a teenager. And they've expressed interest in immersive storytelling. Now you basically, it's like the White Lotus, stand at the garden gates. It's like, all right, we can dive into the Matrix. You gotta know these things up front. There's gonna be emotional vulnerability. You're gonna have to play nicely and be respectful to everybody else. This is gonna be heavily empathic. If we hit those things right, it's gonna be satisfying and fulfilling. And we're gonna trust each other as humans more on the other side. But there's gonna be rough patches, and there's gonna be times where you experience very intense real emotions that even metacognitively, you may try to justify why you're allowed or not allowed to feel these things, Ultimately, that's a higher level of gameplay, but it's not for everyone. I've met players that have been playing for 10, 15 years that still are not mature enough as gamers or as people to really be entrusted with that kind of experience, especially when it comes to the tool sets we've mentioned. Again, this is all permission based. When I started Garrus, which is kind of like my standard for how these immersive tools can be applied elegantly, it started with, this is the game I'm comfortable running as a DM. You are players I have played with for years that I am comfortable being vulnerable with my world too. I am trusting you to not violate the experience that we are agreeing on together. If you would like to participate, you are welcome to attend our session 0. If this is too intense for you, because this is going to be intense prep, you're welcome to bow out, right? And that doesn't mean I won't play with you. It just means that this particular experience isn't going to be a good fit, So every single player opted to play. Nobody bowed out, because ultimately they now had control and they were empowered to make the responsible decision. And the responsible decision being, I'm going to take this somewhat seriously and actually put this prep work into my character. Children under the age of, I would say 12, developmentally don't understand the impact of that kind of responsibility. They just don't have the life experience or the biology to keep up with it, So ultimately, it's not an experience I would offer them. But this is even for the game. I think I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned on the podcast, I'm playing a game with my grandma right now because she's like super into this. I didn't do any of these techniques because teaching her the mechanics of the game is more important than doing a deep dive, emotionally vulnerable, immersive game,
Thank you so much for listening to some of our podcast highlights. This podcast is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. If you want to support the content creators, feel free to visit our Patreon. And please, game responsibly.